of the timeline. The session today is also being recorded, and if you have some technical issues or for some reason you would like to watch the session later on, it will also be available to watch after the session. So next slide, please. As for our agenda today, we will start with a brief opening remarks. Then we'll proceed to the keynote speech by MEP representing the Netherlands, Lara Wolters. Then just after our keynote speaker, we will have the opportunity to listen to an update on the NFRD development by a policy officer of the European Commission, Elena Arveras, and we'll further proceed to our panel discussion that will cover various aspects of NFI for SMEs. We will further proceed to the Q&A session, and I would like to once again welcome you to ask as many questions as you like and comment to the presentation that you hear. And finally, our webinar today will be concluded by final remarks by Florin Toma, President of the Accountancy Europe. So I hope that the housekeeping details and the structure of the session are clear, and let me start with the brief introduction of the session today. I think it's undeniable that we are all facing environmental and social challenges that need to be addressed. Climate risks are getting more visible across Europe, and in the past couple of years we evidenced extreme weather conditions also in Europe, taking people's lives, destroying livelihoods, and causing billions of euros damages to homes, businesses, people. A lot of work needs to be done also to address social issues and employer rights issues to combat bribery and corruption. Those challenges need to be addressed collectively and also by the business community, and in particular by the small business community as well, being so important for Europe. And also those challenges require actionable solutions. Could non-financial reporting be a way of addressing those challenges? Is this the right solution for the SMEs? And how can we balance between the need to address the challenges and making sure that we're not creating additional burden to small businesses who are already very heavily impacted by the current crisis situation? So the purpose of our virtual meeting today is to discuss what are the NFI requirements SMEs are expected to face in the next few years, from whom, legislation, banks, supply chains, what are the practical challenges and opportunities for the SMEs, and how the SMEs can cope with those requirements, and also what can be the role of the accountants in assisting them in this process. So this is the introduction. This is what we would like to look at in the session. And without the delay, I'm delighted to proceed to the beginning of our discussion today and present our keynote speaker, Lara Wolters. Lara is a Dutch member of European Parliament, group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. She's a member of the Committee on Budgetary Control of the Parliament, in which she strives for transparent and fraud-free Europe, and a member of the Committee of Legal Affairs Jury Committee, where she is actively advocating responsible business conduct. Lara Wolters is currently a jury rapporteur for the new EU legislation on corporate due diligence and corporate accountability. This legislation will set binding requirements for enterprises to respect people and planet in their value chains. In her keynote speech, we hope that Lara will, among others, provide an overview of the European Parliament's thinking concerning NFI requirements for SMEs and how SMEs can be helped in addressing those requirements and when facing them. Lara will not be able to stay with us until the end of the session and until the Q&A, but you will have the opportunity to ask her questions right after her presentation. So don't hesitate to type your questions in Slido during Lara's discussion, and I'll be happy to ask Lara the questions that we received during her presentation. Thanks a lot, Lara, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'll jump right in because I think I've got 10 minutes and MEPs have the habit of always thinking they're not speaking for a long time, but then going over their time wildly. You just said it, I'm a member of the Legal Affairs Committee, a rapporteur on the ongoing negotiations on due diligence, and maybe just for those less familiar with due diligence, current sense of the word, due diligence meant in the ESG way, if you will. So responsible business conduct that asks companies to look at the consequences of their business on the environment, on social matters, on human rights and on governance. And I say that because, of course, I'm aware of the audience here today. And of course, we've also got due diligence, in a contract or in an audit way. But at the moment, the exercise that we're doing in the URI committee is one more of behavioral standards. And the reason that I'm writing a legislative draft on that is that the Parliament, like the Commission, believes that the time is now right to go further than requirements on non-financial information, but that it's time to start setting some behavioral standards for companies. And that thought exercise that aims to fit into the legislative proposals that we're expecting from the Commission and that I think you'll hear more about later today, does not only limit itself to due diligence. So at the same time, as me having been writing my report and negotiating, there's also been another relevant report in that Legal Affairs Committee on broader corporate governance questions. And that report, and some might be aware and some might not, but has been written and just adopted on Monday, actually, by our committee and written by my colleague Pascal Durand from the Renew Group. And it covers non-financial information requirements and general statements on NFRD. And in that report, and that's the first point that might be relevant here, since we're talking about SMEs, is that we've taken a position on the scope of NFRD, and we've said, okay, that should be extended to companies with more than 250 employees from 500 today. So at the moment there, we haven't said we need to get SMEs into scope, we need to go below 250. At the moment, the consensus in our committee there was companies from 250 employees onwards, from 500 today. In that report, we've also talked about directors' duties, clarifying those, and with clarifying, I mean clarifying what their duties are towards society, if you will. So not only the duties that are material towards the company and towards the inside, but also towards the outside. We've also called for more comparable and standardized data, which I'm sure that would be very, very welcome with the audience here today. And we've asked for robust multi-stakeholder processes, both when legislating on the data which should be disclosed in the context of NFRD, but also in the determination within a company of the non-financial reporting strategy itself. And that democracy, if you will, approach both at EU level, at Commission and level 2 level, and within a company is very important, I think. Finally, there's consensus among shadows that non-EU companies should be within the scope of NFRD. And similarly, in my report on due diligence, I also talk about non-EU companies and their duties if they want to operate on the internal market. So those are the contours of the Parliament's demands on NFRD and on broader corporate governance questions. And to come back to SMEs, which of course this panel is about today, we have not explicitly asked to make periodical reporting on non-financial information mandatory for SMEs. But for me, that is not to say that they shouldn't have a role and that they shouldn't be part of the legislative package that we're expecting from the Commission. And the reasons for that are reasons that I have used in my report on due diligence towards the other shadows to say, look, these things are important for SMEs actually. So the shift now, if you're still following me, will go from NFRD to my report. So on due diligence, it's always been my intention to include SMEs for several reasons. And maybe just again, for those less familiar with due diligence, so that's the continuous obligation to avoid, to mitigate, and to account for, to remedy also risks within the value chains of companies. And there, I think it is very important to include SMEs because they can be exposed to risks as well. And one of the examples that I use sometimes is you can be a very small, say, diamond company in Antwerp, and maybe you only have a few people working for you, but your turnover can be huge. And in terms of your value chain, where your diamonds come from can actually involve human rights risks and so forth. That won't be smaller just because you're a smaller company. So that is the first reason that I have included them in my report on due diligence. I also think that if you look at the cost benefit, let's say, of SMEs and including them here, it's I think that you can make due diligence risk-based, and I think you can make it proportionate to the size or sector and the capacity of the SME. And I think that therefore, if you look at cost benefit, this makes sense, because we're not asking in due diligence for companies to look at everything under the sun and every single aspect of their supply chain, but we're giving companies the discretion to look at the risks that are most salient to them, and that of course would include SMEs. So if an SME knows that it only is exposed to a particular type of risk in a particular type of geographical area, then it can look at that, and on the rest there wouldn't be so much work because it wouldn't be relevant to it. And that discretion, I think, is very important, and I'm very, very willing to give that discretion, of course, to companies, and not make this into a box-ticking exercise where you're obliged to go through all these steps that actually aren't relevant for you as a company. I also think that the reason they should be included in due diligence is that SMEs have an important position in the value chain of larger companies, and it'll be very much more difficult for large companies to perform their due diligence if they cannot get information from the SMEs in their value chain. And I think very similarly, to make a little parallel to the disclosure regulation, financial institutions have to disclose the sustainability characteristics of their investments. But that's only practically possible if investee companies, including SMEs, report on those things. And that's similar in due diligence, I think. And I think that while SMEs may have specific challenges in terms of capacity and the possibility to exercise influence over their value chain, I do think that they're more flexible and that their value chains may be less complex. So I think we often think, oh, bigger companies have more capacity to perform due diligence or to look at NFI. But actually, of course, the bigger you are, the more business relationships you will have and so forth, the more companies in your tier one. And therefore, sometimes that is not the case. And actually, it's simpler value chain that's easier to look at and to report on for SMEs. And lastly, one of the arguments that I've heard now a number of times from investor communities and from the OECD is that banks and investors are, of course, requiring due diligence, so behavioral due diligence and non-financial information more and more from SMEs. It can lead to cheaper loans, for instance. It can lead to getting a loan or not. And I think that there's many examples now where investors are being more and more demanding, banks as well, and where they want SMEs to do this. And I think, therefore, in a way, if we want to make legislation now on due diligence that is future-proof, I think there's a sense in including them. So for all those reasons, and apologies for the long list, but I think that they should be covered by due diligence legislation. Of course, as I said, taking into account proportionality, making this risk-based, and supporting them also with specific guidelines and, where possible, with funds. And as I was saying before, for me, arguments that I just mentioned on due diligence are actually relevant for NFRD as well, or for broader corporate governance questions. And of course, we'll get to those when the Commission makes its legislative proposals. There was one more question that you had asked me, because of course the specific question you're also interested in is how can we make sure that we don't overburden SMEs by these possible requirements. And I think that in part I've already answered that question, talking about proportionality, which, by the way, I think, of course, should be in line with OECD principles, and in the case of due diligence with Principle 17 of the UNGPs. If people are familiar with that, they might not be, but I think it's important there not to reinvent the wheel. But as I said, I also think it'll be important for there to be specific guidelines so that SMEs can be taken by the hand sounds too patronizing, I think, but can be helped in knowing exactly what is expected of them. I think that's important. And I also see a role there for supervisory authorities. And in my mind, at least for due diligence, supervisory authorities would ideally not be acting as a watchdog so much, but almost like a sparring partner in some of these questions that SMEs might have on knowing when they're doing the right thing. Financial support, I think I mentioned. And so I think I'll leave it there on my remarks, and I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you so much. It was really very useful and very informative presentation. Thank you so much for sharing all the details with us. And indeed, as you said, the proportionality and not overburdening the SMEs in this context is very important, because we all know how much they're being hit by the current crisis, and it's important that it's kind of organically gets integrated into their recovery process. And you mentioned that also Parliament discusses the possibility of providing financial assistance to the small entities who will need to be coping with those new requirements and expectations. As we know, quite a lot of small entities, small, medium-sized enterprises, they rely on external advice of accountants or professional assistants. So did you think of integrating this professional advice or a possibility of, for example, providing additional financing so that the small entities could reach out to their professional advisors, because it means additional scope of work, and they're so close at the same time, and they have all the data about the small businesses. What is it discussed? Is it within the scope, or is it a bit too far and too much in detail?
I think it absolutely is within the scope, and I think in negotiations, especially in this exercise, which is a legislative initiative, but of course, which is also a political signal. I think the beauty of the process is that everything and anything is on the table, because this is not the legislation yet. This is the detailed but also political signal on what we want the legislation to look like. And what I've done so far is I've talked about expertise and financial support in general terms. But I think what you say is very relevant about professional advice, and particularly also the role of certain professions in there, and including, of course, the special role of accountants. So I'd be very happy to receive further input on that if you have it. I think in my report I'll keep it more general, and we'll probably stay on general financial support and the importance of access to expertise and the relevant expertise for SMEs. But since, of course, we're writing a report now, that is only the beginning of the process, and afterwards we're going to be doing this all over again once we have the Commission proposal. I think the time is absolutely right for you, if you have that, to provide me with more detail, and maybe there's a place for it in the actual legislation.
Thank you, Lara. That's a very valuable comment. And actually, we've received 2 questions. If you have a couple of more minutes to comment on them. So the first question, actually, I think it goes along in line with the question that I asked you first. Since the SMEs are generally not that formalized in risk evaluation, don't you think that the NFRD may determine supplementary pressure on SMEs? And maybe, as we already discussed, that it could partially be addressed through their assistance to the SMEs via the professional advisors. Do you have anything else to add on that point?
Could you repeat the question? Because the question was about putting supplementary pressure on SMEs?
Yes, so it's basically, the question is that it's not common for the SMEs to work with risk evaluation. And well, the question is if you think it puts supplementary pressure on them, given that they don't have the competency of dealing with that.
I'm not naive in thinking that this adds no pressure, because of course, I mean, whatever new rules you make adds additional burden. I also think that if we get due diligence right, that in a way that might mean that there's less reason to change things within NFRD or within corporate governance, because I think what we're doing in NFRD will already go a long way to reporting in NFRD, because in a sense there's overlap there. And if you're talking about non-financial information and periodical reporting, actually what you're being asked to do in due diligence is, an ongoing monitoring of your value chain. And if you do that in a proportional way, then I think actually you're already capturing a lot of what you'd otherwise ask through NFRD. So I hope that there we can find synergies, if you will, that mean that you wouldn't need to put in SME requirements that are heavy both in NFRD and in due diligence. And of course, that pressure that you mentioned, I'm aware of. So as I said, I don't think that this will mean nothing. At the same time, I think that the robustness of a company can improve through doing things like this. And the research at the moment also in the Commission's added value assessment is, of course, that ultimately that this is good for companies' resilience and for companies' return on investment. And I think that this might be a bit of a question of short-term pain, long-term gain, because of course in the short term these things are difficult. But as I said, I think in order to future-proof companies, in order to maybe unlock some benefits as well in terms of financing and so forth, I think it's important to do things, and therefore we need to, to nudge companies in the right way. Of course, as I said, doing that, bearing in mind the need for proportionality and the importance of doing this in a risk-based way that doesn't just require companies to go and report and do things that are just not relevant to them.
Thank you, Lara. And then we have another quite interesting question, actually getting back to the duplication of efforts. One of the participants is asking, why is legislation needed for SMEs when larger companies are already asking for this information to be submitted by SMEs? Is it not the way a free market operates?
I think that any question on how the free market operates, of course, for a socialist or for a social democrat, is maybe not a topic for 10 o'clock in the morning on a weekday, because right. these are long discussions. But I think that in terms of the duplication of effort, as I said, I think that's something that we need to be aware of. But I don't, within due diligence, I don't see this as duplication. And I think that for larger companies also to be able to perform their due diligence, given that the largest part of our economy is actually SMEs, if SMEs don't do this, then actually the exercise will become irrelevant, because the moment that there's an SME in a value chain, it'll be a black box and we won't be able to see what's gone on in the value chain. So I think that in order to do this and to get a good picture of what goes on, we do need to do this. But as said, bearing in mind proportionality, bearing in mind the capacity of SMEs and so forth.
Thank you, Lara. It's really interesting and relevant, and we should always think of the balance, because if we don't do anything, if we don't address those existing challenges, they will not go anywhere, and we'll just be finding ourselves in an even more difficult situation in years. So there is indeed need for action, but the proportionality and adequacy of those is very important. And thank you so much for your very detailed presentation. I think it was really valuable for all the participants here today, and thanks for finding time for joining us this morning. Apologies for the difficult question about the free market, but
no. Apologies for not having answered it in a more detailed way. Maybe one thing that I forgot to mention, and maybe just as a as a bit of proof that I do really take this seriously, in my proposal on due diligence, one thing that I included as well is a statement of no risk. And what I did was I made a proposal where I said, look, if you're a small company, for instance, and if you know that the risks that we're talking about here just do not apply to you and that they do not exist in your value chain because, for instance, you're only operating locally or you're only operating, within a geographical area where there just is no risk, then you can issue a no risk statement. Basically, you can issue a statement that says, look, we've looked at this, but it isn't there for us, and therefore this is where due diligence for us stops. And that's something that we're still negotiating at the moment. There were those who said that this went too far in a way. There were those who said that this is a good idea. But I did that exactly because I thought, look, we shouldn't be forcing companies to do things where there's just no point in them doing it. And I think that if we say that this shouldn't be a box ticking exercise, I think that goes in different directions. I think it means not obliging useless exercises, but also taking a mature approach and saying that there's discretion for companies in determining what for them is salient risk, what for them is relevant, and having them look at those instead of absolutely everything that we in Brussels thought up. So maybe just that addition, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Lara. That was an excellent presentation, and thank you for your really in-depth approach and all the answers to your questions. I see that we don't have any more questions, so thanks for finding time for us today. If you have time to stay with us, you're very welcome to do so. But we do understand that you are very busy, so thanks for finding time for us. Thank you, Lara.
You're very welcome. I'll stay a little bit to listen to 10 more minutes or so, and then I will have to go. But thank you very much for having me, and I hope the rest of your morning is fruitful.
Thank you, Lara. And I think at this point, it would be excellent to get an update from the European Commission on the revision of the non-financial reporting directive. And I'm delighted to give the floor to one of the leading experts in this area, Elena Arveras, Policy Officer for Non-Financial Reporting from the European Commission. Elena will not be able to stay with us until the end of the event. So if you have any questions, if you could show the slide on the screen once again, please don't hesitate to ask Elena questions using Slido. Just think of comments, think of questions during Elena's presentation. And well, the floor is yours, Elena. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, after this very good presentation from Lara, I'm just going to focus it a bit more on what the Commission is working right now in the proposal of the revision of the NFRD. As you know, we are planning this proposal to be adopted in Q1 next. And I'll focus on some of the aspects that we're looking into that maybe more to SMEs, given the focus of the discussion today. So, as Lara was pointed out, we've seen that in recent years, demands for information from SMEs have risen, even just market-driven by investors, by banks that have SMEs as clients, or even by companies in the real economy that have SMEs in their supply chains. We do expect that these demands will increase as a result of the new sustainable finance-related legislation, like the investor disclosure regulation, like the taxonomy regulation itself. As you know, there are some requirements on NFRD companies themselves to report certain indicators of the activities to the taxonomy. So if we are asking a bank to report how much of its investments or how much of its activities are taxonomy aligned, this bank will need information about its clients. So there are many knock-on effects that might come as a result of this and as a result of this sustainable finance legislation. On top of that, we are looking in the context of the revision of the NFRD to issues such as expanding the scope in a way, and to issues related to the standardization of the requirements, as you know. So these are aspects we are looking into. Nothing has been decided yet until the Commission adopts a proposal, but in any case, we can expect that also from changes in the NFRD itself, even if these changes do not affect directly SMEs, they could have knock-on effects. If you include more companies in the scope, even if, for example, these were large companies or large PIEs, removing this threshold of 500 employees that Lara was mentioning, for example. In this case, this would have SMEs that are suppliers or that are clients of this. So we've also analyzed these impacts in our impact process during the past months. And in this context, I think it's worth coming to the issue, to the aspect of the need to standardize information, because it is in here where we think there would be space to make SMEs have a role in this process, and not just to leave them waiting for this increase in demands and the possibility for them to answer to these demands by themselves. So in the context of standards, of standardization of this information, as you may know, Commissioner Dombrovskis asked EFRAG to start some preparatory work in the field of standard setting to basically gain some time in case this is the decision adopted first by the Commission in its proposal and then by co-legislators. If the EU were to require NFRD companies to report against EU standards, then this work on the standards basically need to start as soon as possible in order to have a first reporting cycle by all these companies soon enough. If we wait for a proposal to be adopted, for a legislation to be adopted, with this technical work, the first reporting cycle in such a detailed manner would be much in maybe, I don't know, 2027 or who knows when. So the idea is to take a controlled risk approach and start doing some preparatory work to be as advanced as possible if this decision comes, when this decision comes. So in this context, in this mandate that was given to EFRAG, Commissioner Dombrovskis explicitly referred to the need to look into simplified standards for SMEs. So even if these standards were there for a voluntary use by SMEs, we believe that they could be a very useful tool for SMEs to respond to this increase of demands of information. So last week, I think it was, today is Wednesday, no, today is Thursday. Last week was published a progress report by the EFRAG project task force that has been working on this. They've only been working for some weeks, so it doesn't go into the nitty-gritty details, but it already gives a bit of a framework of how they recommendations to the Commission should focus, basically the aspects they should focus on. This final report from the project task force is expected by January. And in this context, of course, the recommendations would fit to the extent necessary in the legislative proposal. Together with this mandate to EFRAG to work on the technical recommendations to the Commission on how these standards could or should look like, there was another mandate issued by the Commission to Jean-Paul Gauzès, who is the chairman of EFRAG. And in this mandate, basically, he was asked to propose what would be the changes needed to the governance structure of EFRAG if it was decided that EFRAG would be the standard setter in the end. So the progress report with regard to this, so the mandate, has also been published. I believe there will be some kind of small consultation or more formal feedback that EFRAG will search with regard to this report. But in any case, both of them are contributing a lot to the work in the context of the NFRD revision. We do see this aspect of standardization a key aspect, not only for reasons of comparability of the information and to ensure that all the relevant information is disclosed, but also to allow for the digitalization of information, for example, or for imposing audit requirements if this was decided, or for allowing better supervision of national competent authorities of the reporting by NFRD companies. If there is no reporting in a standardized manner, it's very difficult to enforce these requirements. At the same time, we've also got the feedback that these standards would also help companies in a way, because at the moment the reporting requirements of the NFRD are so high level and not so detailed, and in a way it also creates complexity for companies themselves that aren't even sure if they are accurately complying with the law, or if they are covering everything they should. So in a way, this call for flexibility that we had many years ago when the directive was being prepared and negotiated has changed in a way, even from the corporate perspective, because they feel that they do need this extra guidance. And at the same time, we also expect that if reporting was done according to these standards, but then again, let's see if this is what's decided in the end. If that was the case, this would also remove these extra ad hoc demands for information that companies receive. So in a way, we are not facing a decision between imposing extra requirements that would increase burden versus doing nothing and remain in terms of burden as we are today. We do expect this increase in demands from different actors, and this is basically a dynamic scenario, a dynamic baseline scenario, and in that way, we do believe that the intervention is completely necessary and justified. But I leave it here so that we have time for questions. Very grateful to receive them.
Thank you, Elena, for your great presentation. And well, indeed, we actually have our first question. And the first question is, what is the view of the Commission on the assurance of NFRD for SMEs? The financial effort may be a significant issue for them. Could you comment on that, please?
So, as I said, we're looking into different possibilities with regard to expanding the scope of the NFRD. So the first question would be if SMEs would at all be captured or not. Maybe there is a reason for including SMEs listed in EU-regulated markets, for instance, in order to have same requirements on unlisted companies in EU capital markets, because that's in principle, that's the principle that should real. But at the same time, we do need to consider this proportionality issue. So I think the assurance question, of course, first of all, relates to whether these companies would be required to report information according to the NFI, and if they were required to report this information, then the audit requirements would, in my opinion, need to be, because if not, again, we are making a distinction between companies that are listed and all of them having access to this capital. So in as you know, the rule that is the main rule is transparency. So the transparency to investors needs to be ensured, and that's basically the price one has to pay if the company decides to access these capital markets. But of course, because all these might or would come together, they are aspects that we need to consider very carefully. It's not only the reporting requirement. If we decided that an audit is required, it would also come with an audit requirement, and indeed the burden would be considerably higher.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Elena. And then we have one more question. So actually, the question that came earlier. So it's what about when is the NFRD revision? When is the revision of NFRD expected?
Sure. The Commission revised work program planned it for Q1 next year. Our working assumption is that we will package it with the renewed sustainable finance strategy, which probably will be adopted by the end of Q1. So probably we're looking into March. But again, this is our working assumption. It very much depends on internal procedures.
Thank you, Elena. Do we have time for one more question? Do you have another minute? Thank you, Elena. Then my question is, what is the European Commission planning to support SMEs that will have to face the NFI requirements, even they are not now included in the NFRD? Do you plan some sort of transitional period of educating the SMEs more actively? Because I think that the message still needs to be brought, and it needs to be to sound a bit stronger about the why it's so important. So is any work planned around that?
I think communication efforts are very much needed, because indeed the concept that normally everyone hears is, oh, this is a lot of burden, but no one is really looking into the positive side of the story and the risk of not being included in all these changes, basically. I think the first question is whether SMEs or some SMEs would be included under the scope. The second question is, even if that wasn't the case, as I said before, we do believe that probably via the development of some kind of simplified standards, we could do this education part on SMEs and also help them understand what kind of information is what others in their supply chains or their banks that are lending the money would need. So probably the strongest tool we have is on some simplified standards that really help them in practical terms. And then, of course, the other side of the story is the communication issue, which indeed I think we should keep working on, so that they become aware of what the situation is and of all these changes in the EU legal framework, because they will affect them indirectly. Even if they are not subject to the investor disclosure regulation or the taxonomy regulation, they will be affected. So they need to be aware that this is going to kick in next year, basically.
Thank you, Elena. That's a very, very useful comment, and I think that the narrative that we keep hearing is that while SMEs are so badly hit by the crisis, we're going to overburden them, we're going to add additional complexity, and that's what we keep hearing. But I think the educational effort is very important, because we can always see some really tangible benefits of running sustainable business and on reporting and actually rethinking the business, that can bring also some very tangible returns on investment, for example, in that. So I think we all need to be more vocal, speaking about those opportunities and educating also the small business sector on those opportunities and sharing some concrete stories, because I think that's what really matters to accept those standards, even if they are voluntary in the future.
Indeed.
So, Elena, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us this morning. Well, if you are able to stay with us for some more time, that would be great. But well, we do understand that if you have other commitments and you have to leave. That's
Thank you. Yes, Saturday I have to leave in 5 minutes. 45. Well, 2 minutes now.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for joining us this morning. It was a great presentation, and thanks for your comments as well.
Thank you for the invitation. Good luck.
Thank you. Thanks, Elena. So, yeah, I think we are actually logically proceeding to the next part of our discussion. It will be a panel discussion. And we have excellent panelists who I'm sure will be happy to share their insights on different aspects of NFI for SMEs. And I would like to once again remind to the participants, to our audience, that please don't hesitate to ask questions also during the presentation of our panelists, so that we are able to address them. On the screen now you can see the slides. The slide was the information about Slido and the code that you need to be using to ask the question. And we'll start our discussion with the presentation with a comment by Luke Hendrickx, Director for Legal Affairs and Enterprise Policy, SME United. Thanks, Luke, for sharing your insight on that important topic.
Thank you, Aleksandra, and also on behalf of SME United, I would like to welcome all the participants here to this conference. And I think that after the introduction of Lara Wolters, I think we have already another topic for a next conference in mind. I would like to quickly go through the position of SME United in this. Maybe it's already known, but as we are working on this file since many years, we think that non-financial disclosure should remain voluntary engagement for small and medium-sized enterprises and for the entrepreneurs, and therefore that the scope of the directive should not be enlarged. Also, the entrepreneurs, they should have the possibility to choose the appropriate way to report for their specific situation and the needs of their stakeholders. But in general, we fully recognize and we also support that SME are more active in disclosure of non-financial information, because indeed we believe that disclosure of non-financial information can be useful for most of the SMEs, that it can be useful for the decision-making process also in small and medium-sized enterprises. But there are some buts. I've listened very carefully to Ms. Wolters and also to Elena concerning the scope of the directive. Of course, even if it's not the intention to include small and medium-sized enterprises, it's not enough. It's not enough to say we are not going to burden the small and medium-sized enterprises, because in fact, and this is also maybe one of the misunderstandings, is that SMEs today already report quite a lot concerning non-financial information. In fact, every SME already does it, be it on social affairs, on environmental issues, for statistic reasons. The only problem is that it's not always known, and there the application of the only once principle should certainly help a lot. On the other hand, and it has been also recognized and clearly mentioned by both Ms. Wolters and by the Commission, is there are the knock-on effects of non-financial information requirements for the big enterprises towards the small and medium-sized enterprises. And this is extremely important. First of all, there is a trickle-down effect for SMEs that are subcontractors of bigger enterprises. And then we will have the consequences of the taxonomy regulation. And therefore, we are in favor of a SME-friendly approach. It has been mentioned, simplified standards for SMEs, yes and no. What we want is simple standards for small and medium-sized enterprises, and that we should start from the think small first approach. Because we have always seen that simplifying standards does not work. I refer here, for example, to Arveras for SMEs. You cannot a standard that is developed for the big enterprises simply cut somewhere and then to say, oh, this should be applicable for small enterprises. No, a small enterprise is not a little big enterprise. So we should start also in standardization from a standard that can be applied in the majority of the enterprises, so in the micro enterprises, and then to extend it, also apply the principle of proportionality, modular approach also to the bigger enterprises. And I think this is the only way to ensure that there will be no additional burdens for small and medium-sized enterprises. So start from the possibilities, the needs, the characteristics of the small enterprises, because this is also, of course, a problem. The users of non-financial information of big enterprises and small enterprises, they are completely different. We have different stakeholders, and we see this also already when we are communicating, when our small enterprises are making non-financial information, that it is more targeted to their direct environment, and often that this reporting is done in a non-formal way, and this is, I think, more important, because with reporting we cannot change the word. It's more important that instead of reporting, of passive reporting, that we go to action. And this is something that we should try to achieve, and that we should also try to improve. I also welcomed what the Commission said, and also what the Parliament is intending to propose is support for small and medium-sized enterprises in this respect. You can read it, but already 10 years ago, when there was the proposal of the directive on non-financial information, we have already asked in our position papers to help SMEs, to help them to make non-financial information, to provide tools, to provide adapted tools to help them, but nothing happened in those 9 years. So it would be a little bit wrong to point out to small and medium-sized enterprises and saying, oh, you do not report enough towards the different stakeholders. I will leave it here because I think I'm running out of time. if there are questions, of course, I'm willing to answer them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luc. We'll proceed to the Q&A right after the presentation of all the panelists, but thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's very important to learn and to know about the challenges that the SMEs are facing. And as you rightly mentioned, action should be priority. And of course, we should be all thinking on how we can address the challenges, not only report on them. That's absolutely central. And I think we're all in agreement with that. And also to the point of assistance to the SMEs, I think we have a perfect panel today. We can also discuss on what the accountants can do as the trusted advisors to the SMEs, of course, but it needs to have some more top-down support also to the accountancy sector that might potentially be doing more work for the small business sector. But I'm sure we'll cover it in the later presentation. And without the delay, I'm delighted to introduce our next panelist, Bouke de Vries, Chair of the Working Group on Green and Sustainable Finance of the European Association of Cooperative Banks. Bouke is leading the climate program at Rabobank as well, and he will be presenting us the NFI topic from the bank's perspective, and also how banks and what type of information that banks is interested in from SMEs, and also how banks could potentially help to the SMEs reporting on those indicators on this non-financial information. So Bouke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So indeed, I will try to give you the banker's view, and especially the cooperative banker's view. So let me start by stating that our society is facing increasing challenges on climate, on biodiversity, the threat of ecosystems. And although SMEs, which are of course also our clients, Rabobank's clients, cooperative banks' clients, although they are not obliged to report in the NFI, we believe that they are confronted with the same risks nonetheless. And they also have a carbon footprint. And as Luc said, indeed, they already report a lot. So we think it's important that we find a way to include them in this process that we have embarked upon together, and to try to develop simplified standards to make it possible also to make visible what SMEs are already doing in this very important regard. So looking at the interest of banks for this information, it has been explained very well at the start of our meeting, but I will repeat some of the elements. We need to disclose the largest transition risks in our portfolio. We need to be aware what kind of fiscal risks are threatening our economy and our clients. These will be large clients, but these will also be smaller and medium-sized clients. And the second element is that we agreed to support the Paris Agreement and to help the economy transform in the next decade into a carbon-low economy, and in the next 30 years into a carbon-neutral economy. And to make that possible, we need to be able to track where is the economy right now and where will it be in the next 10 years. We also need to price risk to give discounts if companies are doing extremely well. And we need to be able to assess the footprint of a client. So having said this, we clearly need to work together on this. We sense support in SMEs for this, and we also sense a keen interest taken by the accountancy sector. And this accountancy sector is important, I would like to state, to verify data and to make sure that if we disclose something, that it can be supported by evidence. I also think that the accountancy sector can help us in developing the right standards, and also in assisting the SMEs and in verifying the data which are included in annual accounts. So what exactly is needed? In the coming years, we will need data points for energy consumption of companies. We would like to be able to make an indicator, for example, of energy use divided by square meters of a company. We need to get a better view on the materials flow. This is the work in the circular economy. We are quite aware that the economy is changing. Our clients are changing. Many of them will be very successful in this change. Some of them may lag behind. And we want to know exactly where our clients are. And also, we would like to help them and make sure that our financial services are tailored to their needs. We will also need data on land use. And you're quite aware, I assume, that many cooperative banks also provide loans to the agricultural sector. Also, this sector is changing dramatically. And we would like to position ourselves next to the client so we can jointly make sure that this transition will happen and will be a successful one. A bit rounding off, we need to have meaningful European and global standards. If we say something is green, it should be agreed upon by a large group. So we look with keen interest to the green taxonomy. And although this is at the start mostly developed for listed companies, for asset managers use, we are going to use as a banking sector elements from this taxonomy. Also, when we provide loans to our SME clients, we can't transpose directly these methods, but we are very interested in trying to develop that. The second point there is the circular economy standards. It's not discussed today to a large extent, but it is also important that if we are redesigning sectors and we would like to measure that, then we need standards. So the last point would be then those data that should be accessible. And the European Association of Cooperative Banks, but also the commercial banks and the savings banks, they've asked the Commission to look into an ESG database so that data are at low cost accessible for our clients and for our institutions. Later on, if we are in a debate, I could also give you some examples of how we help our clients. For example, the industry is also going to benchmark clients and show the client how well their performance stands out compared to the peers in the sector. So I would like to leave it here and very much look forward to have a debate with you.
Yeah, thank you, Bouke. That's really interesting to learn about this bank's perspective, and it's extremely interesting also to learn about the examples on how you're supporting the SME businesses, because I think that's the recurring questions. How do we help SMEs? How do advise them best on reporting? And actually, I think how do we educate them on the importance of sustainability in general, but also on the reporting on certain non-financial indicators that's central, and I think it should be a collective effort for all of us addressing that. And I think it's very logical that we transition to our next speaker, Paul Gisby, Paul is a senior manager from Accountancy Europe, and I'm sure that Paul will share with us some views on what accountants can do to help SMEs achieve their sustainable maturity to report and comply with the growing requirements in non-financial reporting. So, Paul, the floor is yours, and very, very interested to hear what are the solutions, how we as accountancy profession can help.
Thank you, Aleksandra, and good morning, everybody out there in YouTube land. It's great to be able to speak to you on behalf of Accountancy Europe about SMEs and sustainability. We've heard how important the SME sector is to Europe in respect of GDP and job creation, but the amount of the GDP it generates obviously is related to carbon emissions. So we absolutely agree that SMEs need to take action in respect of all ESG matters and particularly carbon emissions. And we've also heard some of the drivers already, so I won't go further into these, the prospect of legislative changes and the feeding down of requirements through the supply chain, through public sector clients, through large companies and via providers of finance. But also there are positive reasons why SMEs should embrace such changes. SMEs are typically the driving force behind many innovations. And this will also apply to green technology. By focusing attention on greening their products and processes, European SMEs will have the chance to become world leaders in innovative products and services, helping to improve European competitiveness as the rest of the world struggles to catch up. Investing in new technologies can help costs as well as emissions. If you green your business model, it can help produce positive branding, and this is likely to be more and more crucial for consumer-facing businesses in the near future. It can also help attract highly motivated staff. There have been several high-profile studies recently that have indicated that green businesses are more attractive to young people and who actually may be willing to sacrifice some salary to work for an ethical or green business. And this could help offset the difficulty in attracting talent that smaller businesses often face. So we have effectively, as we would say in the UK, a carrot and stick approach, the stick being regulation and downward fee, and the carrot also being positive benefits. And accountants need to take a part in actually both sides of this. So what role do accountants play in helping SMEs to agree in a future? Well, for a start, to be honest, they need to move to greening their own business models for all the reasons that we've already discussed. But additionally, if an accountant wants to really help their SME client with this process, personal experience in the process is vital. Its challenges and hopefully what was done right to ensure that the process was successful. Accountants in most European countries are the advisors with which SMEs have the most contact and who tend to have the most knowledge of their SME businesses. And as such, accountants have a crucial role in highlighting the advantages of a green business model, helping SMEs assess their needs, change their processes, and then review their progress. And obviously, if the accountant themselves has been through this process, they have first-hand knowledge. But to help accountants with this, we think that there is support needed, and this is why we have published our second paper in our risk management series, which deals specifically with sustainability. The risk management series of papers seeks to highlight to SMEs and their accountant advisors the advantages of applying risk management procedures to their business, both to protect the business and also to foster growth. It highlights the well-accepted 5 stages of risk management, namely assessing risk, prioritizing those risks in order of importance, integrating risk management techniques, fourthly, monitoring and evaluating performance, and finally, communicating and reporting. Now, we have to accept, unfortunately, for many SMEs, and unfortunately also for many of their accountant advisors, most of these are still at stage 0. So what we're saying is accountants need, first off, to engage with their SMEs on risk. There's no point talking about reporting if SMEs haven't even considered the issues. So they need to raise awareness with their clients of how climate change in particular, but other ESG factors, can impact the future of their business. Let's face it, SMEs are often in firefighting mode and lack the resources to consider the long-term future of their business. And there is a large danger in not knowing what you don't know, and accountants can help with this knowledge gap. After raising awareness, the next stage is to assess the risks. And in respect of climate change and other environmental issues, we are currently working with the European Association of Cooperative Banks on a basic checklist so that accountants can sit with their clients to run through the risks at this first assessment stage and work out what is most important for them. We hope to have this final product soon, so please keep an eye on our website. Now, the SME and their accountants may not be able to deal with all aspects of integrating risk management processes, but at this stage, we should be at least able to identify those key areas which they need to seek outside guidance on. And this may come from risk from risk managers or specialist insurance brokers, for example. And in respect to this, accountants need to build a network of contacts with other professionals to help SMEs with this process. It's the next stage where things get more difficult though, and this is monitoring. For smaller businesses, building a model of carbon emissions is very, very difficult. Consequently, we think it would be very helpful if legislators, either on a national basis or on a European basis, could provide some sort of database or maybe an emissions modelling calculator that allows SMEs to submit key information relating to their business models and come up with some sort of carbon emissions figure or factor, for example. This could then be used by the SME business and their accountants to monitor the internal progress that they're making and use this as a basis for the SME's first ventures into ESG reporting. And by having this beneficial feedback loop from the empirical information, the SME and the accountants would be able to see what improvements were being made and work to further enhancing this. This would also help provide better information for reporting purposes and thereby reduce the risk of greenwashing and boilerplate reporting. And of course, at the final stage, in reporting and perhaps providing assurance on those reports, if this is required, accountants can play important roles in advising and helping their clients. So I'm going to wrap up now and I'll hand back to Aleksandra, and I'm very happy to take any further questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for your great presentation. It's really close to my heart as a topic because we are always, as an association of chartered certified accountants, we do a lot of work and we talk to our SMEs, and it's absolutely important to bring this message that first of all, sustainability is very important, and to enter to this stage 0 and to explain why greening your business agenda also for the small businesses can be very beneficial. But then also the next step is how do we support small businesses with the tools, with the practical tools, and indeed it should be a collective effort together with broader range of stakeholders, with banks, with investors. We need to really be there to help the SMEs to bring that importance of that agenda and also to support them in reporting, but very importantly in transforming their businesses to more sustainable practices. Well, thank you so much to all the panelists. I think we had a great balance of views between the SMEs, banks, but also what the accountants can do. And I suggest that we now proceed to our Q&A. And I can see that we have more questions coming from our participants, which is really great. And I suggest that we start with the first comment that comes from Thies Ruiten from the Global Reporting Initiative. And we have a comment and a question submitted to the panelists to consider. So I'll start with reading out the comment. GRI has experience with providing capacity building and guidance to SMEs for sustainability reporting. We certainly see possibilities for a growth model building on SMEs' specific needs and on proven successful examples. However, we think that if the European Union were to mandate any sustainability reporting for SMEs, it should start with co-developing solutions together with SME representatives to reduce any reporting burden while providing consistent, reliable and comparable sustainability information. And the question from GRI to the panelists is, rather than developing alternative or simplified standards for SMEs, the EU should ultimately aim to base tailored SME reporting on the same standards that apply to larger enterprises to enhance comparability and usability of the data. What possibilities do you see for a growth model for SME reporting with a tailored approach, including the development of solutions and tools for SMEs? So that's a long question. I hope that our panelists got it. And who would like to volunteer to comment first on this question and comment from GRI? So Luc, would you like to start? Thank you, Luc.
Yes, if I may. Thank you for the question. Because I have a remark on the GRI issue. In fact, the reality is that the existing GRI
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Luc. Paul, would you like to comment on that, on the GRI question as well?
Certainly. I certainly would agree that we don't need another set of standards. I'm relatively familiar with the GRI standards, and they're a good set of standards, a best set of global standards we have at the moment. But I just don't think we're at that stage yet. The definition of SME, if you take the accounting directive, covers a vast range of different sized companies. And if you take the large end of the medium-sized range, then I would tend to agree that there's no reason why these companies shouldn't be using or consider using full GRI, or at least adopt certain standards of GRI. They have enough of an impact on that. But you have to take into account that an estimated 92% of all SMEs in Europe have fewer than 10 or fewer employees. Now, this is probably smaller than the department that calculates materiality in some of these large MNEs. It is just not feasible for them to deal with this level of reporting. But more than that, they're not even at that stage yet. I worked with SMEs for 20 years as a partner of a small firm. And most of my clients, okay, this was 10 years ago, wouldn't even have been thinking about this at that stage. They actually need to sit back and see how ESG issues are going to directly impact their business. This is why we're saying the risk management. And they need to start working on those areas that are going to cause them the biggest difficulties, and then start actually improving their performance in those areas. And it's only after this process is well developed that I think reporting even becomes an issue. We're very much putting the cart before the horse here by concentrating on reporting. What we're looking for is a more sustainable, resilient SME environment. And SMEs looking at their risks is, in our opinion, the first stage of this, and accurate reporting is the last stage of this.
Thank you, Paul. Bouke, would you like to comment on the question from GRI as well?
Yeah, well, so I would like to echo Paul's words, that reporting is a means, it's not an end. And what's most important is to get grip on the risks and to see the opportunities of the change that we are going to embark on. So I would not only approach this as something that SMEs have to do, it's something that they can see as an opportunity as well. And then the reporting part is not the nicest part of it, I understand that, but it helps to get grip on what is important to measure.
Thank you, Bouke. Indeed, it's like a part of the jigsaw that brings this whole very important narrative on the need to adopt the sustainability standards, but also practices also within the SME sector. It's no longer should be seen as a choice, it's just an imperative of today. And actually getting back to the risks, we got a question for Paul. Paul, one of our participants has a question for you. So for a regular SME with 3 employees, out of which 2 are family, any risk model seems difficult to apply and a barrier. How do you see this risk?
Well, I think if something that the last 6 months has told us is it doesn't matter how small you are, risk lives there and it's waiting to get you. And okay, we hope that the current coronavirus crisis is exceptional, but it gives strong indications of the impact of other huge crises like climate change, for instance, could have on SMEs. But in everyday business with an SME, there's risk. And this is what's important, that someone sits down with an SME, or SMEs may be able to do this themselves if they're large enough or if this is their area, and actually really looks at their business model, the environment, and determines what the biggest risks for that business are. And if they determine the biggest risks are, say, cybersecurity at the moment, then that's what they should concentrate on. But just being small doesn't mean you're not risky or you're not subject to risk. And also there's the positive element to risk management as well. This isn't just about avoiding risk. It's impossible anyway. It's about mitigating risk. Every business decision you take has a risk to it. And if you fail to evaluate that risk properly, you may be missing business opportunities, and conversely, you may be going into business opportunities that perhaps you shouldn't have done, or you probably weren't properly prepared for. So what we're saying is, as accountants, as semi-outsiders, i.e. they're not part of your business, but they tend to know a lot more about it than, say, any other professional advisor, they can act as a useful sounding board, a neutral voice, so to speak, for you to actually sit down with and discuss what the risks that most affect your business are, and then start putting in something, processes in place to actually deal with those risks. And I think every business, even the smallest, needs to think about this.
Thank you, Paul. That's an excellent comment. And actually, indeed, risks are very often seen have some negative connotation, but actually if we're presented the way that it can bring you opportunities and mitigating the risks can bring opportunities, I think that's the right way of presenting those, and be it sustainability risks or cybersecurity risks or other types of risks. And I think the SMEs should not be staying away from that narrative, but rather trying to understand it better. And of course, the accountants are there always as trusted advisors to help on that. Luke, we also have a special question for you. So do you think that the no risk statement mentioned by the first speaker, by Lara Wolters, MEP, would be an appropriate way to address the issue and to lower the burden for SMEs?
Thank you, Aleksandra. It looks a very simple question, but I think that we have to reflect on this. At first sight, it sounds very acceptable, not very burdensome for small and medium-sized enterprises indeed. But I think we have to look on what the possible legal consequences can be if an entrepreneur mentioned there is no risk. I think all will depend from the legal consequences of this no risk statement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point, because we don't want to put the SMEs in additional in additional risky situation in case if it turns out that they did not really fall under this category.
I understood from Lara that it was indeed to avoid that SMEs would have to report on issues that are not relevant for them, and this is a very good point, because this indeed we should avoid, because this is exactly often the case with existing reporting standards, that you have to go through a whole list of issues where there is no relevance for the company involved. So the idea in any case is very good in order to avoid administrative burdens, but I feel a little bit that there is a danger in the legal consequences if you do a no risk statement.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Luke. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Luke, for your comment. And well, the very last question, actually, for very brief reply, but I think it's important to ask. So, Bouke, it's a question for you. In the absence of regulatory NFI requirements for SMEs, should the banking sector work on a common framework for the NFI that would require from their SME clients? You have basically like a couple of minutes to comment on that. Sorry for that. We're just running out of time, but very important to address.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, and definitely we are involved in these discussions. And I think one step before that is to share expertise, to share examples, how banks are already now addressing this. So that's, for example, in the market where Rabobank operates, we work together with the Dutch Central Bank. To share examples and expertises, how the industry works on challenges like we discussed now. The second element, I think, is that the banks participate in the EFRAG. So I think that's also a very important direction to come up with that kind of suggestions. And then perhaps the last one to mention here is that EBA, the banking authority, is also doing a pilot to assess risks related to climate and ESG. And I have to say here up front that we are all in a learning stage now. So it is a bit too soon to come up with an alternative approach. But definitely banks are looking into this. And I also see the cooperation that we have here today with the organizations discussing this topic as an excellent start for further discussions on this topic.
Thank you, Bouke, for your comment. And I think we should also think on how the accountancy profession and how we as a profession could also be involved in that work, definitely. And well, I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists today for very interesting both presentations, but also comments and answers to the question. And as we are running out of time, I'd like to pass the floor to the president of the Accountancy Europe, Florin Toma, for the concluding remarks. But thank you so much for all the comments and presentations made before.
Thank you, Aleksandra. Hello, everyone. First of all, I was very excited to hear all the voices that have been sounded the need for NFI and how the non-financial information is looked at from different angles. My takeaways for today are that the fact that the private sector is realizing the need for NFI and takes important steps for acting and disclosing it, that's for sure. However, the SMEs are finding themselves in the supply chain or are taking initiatives by themselves in the same direction. but with limited resources, and that's very important, that might be a burden for themselves, no matter what the standards or regulation will be. I understood very well that banks need this information, and that information will be more relevant and valuable if it would be based on reporting standards. However, within all this ecosystem, SMEs need time to invest and adapt to the new requirements, that's for sure. And I heard that education is key, and any assistance from the from the regulators will be welcomed. So today I might say, based on my experience, but also on the experience of Accountancy Europe, working with its members in Europe, that the accountants are really there and ready to bridge the gap between regulators, banks, and SMEs. And I would say that accountants should be a part in the process of assisting SMEs and regulators and banks into going forward towards regulations and especially standards. So with that, I would like to thank all the panelists and speakers for today's participation and their valuable insights, and also to Aleksandra for moderating today's event. Accountancy Europe realizes the importance of NFI and clearly is unifying the European profession views in order to advance this most important European agenda. I'm sure that we will see you for the next events of Accountancy Europe on this important matter. And I thank you again all for this event. And with that, I would say goodbye to everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.